I would like to welcome Professor Lawrence Edwards from UCT and Prism to the stage for his presentation on rather broadly called trade and growth, but I think he's got something more specific planned. Also, Elizabeth van Renen, from Chief Director from the DTIC, and Professor Marianne Matthee from Gibbs. Thank you so much.
So good afternoon, everyone. And it's good to see everyone in the morning. I hope everyone's had their cup of coffee. I have. Look, this is a very exciting session because it's about international trade. And as you know, us trade economists are now the sexiest economists in town. Everyone wants to talk to us, you know.
That's true.
We are the most interesting people in a cocktail bar. And so I'm very happy to share a glass of wine with you later if you're interested. You pay. Anyway, so welcome. But trade is more than just a topic of interest to some presidents. It's actually a key issue in the growth path. And what we want to talk about today, in particular, is the role that trade can play in driving economic growth in South Africa and the recovery in economic growth in South Africa. The structure of our presentation is I'm going to talk through some slides, but then I'm going to open up the floor to our excellent panel. And we have right on my right here, far right, Elizabeth van Renen. She is the Chief Director, Trade and Research at the DTIC, Trade Policy and Research at the DTIC. But she has a long history involved in trade issues and implementation of trade policy within the DTIC, including negotiating trade agreements. So I think she can provide us some real first-hand experience on the complexity of implementing trade policy and the insights from within the DTIC. To her left, we have Professor Marianne Matthee, and she's currently professor at Gibbs. She used to be at Northwest University, and she's one of the key, actually early empirical researchers looking at data on international trade. And so she provides a very strong insight on some of the empirical work on the data around what drives international trade flows as well. And so I'm very interested to hear her perspectives as well. To say who I am, I'm Lawrence Edwards. I'm a professor of economics. I run a research unit, policy research in international services and manufacturing, based in the University of Cape Town, the School of Economics. And so let me kick off because we're late. I'm going to rush through some of these, I imagine, because we're a bit running out of time. We're started a bit late. But I'm trying to structure this around several questions. I mean, does South Africa face an export predicament? And the answer is yes. What are the sources of South Africa's export decline? I'll say it's lack of dynamism as a key factor. Why do we need to boost export growth? Well, there are many reasons. Is it still possible to embark on an export-oriented growth path? I'll touch on this because this was discussed quite extensively yesterday, and we can take up some of these issues in the panel. And then finally, I'm going to ask, is South African trade and industrial policy fit for export purpose? And the crisis, I think, really is captured in this particular diagram. This is the real value of exports to real GDP of South Africa against a comparative system, set of upper middle income countries, 32 of them, from 2000 to 2022. And this difference and the trends are stark. Now, we know post-2010 export growth slowed globally, but it slowed particularly for South Africa, whereas the rest of, on average, upper middle income countries experienced a rise in real exports to GDP. In other words, export growth was faster than the rest of the economy and essentially pulled GDP upwards. In contrast, what we see in South Africa is, on aggregate over this period, real GDP growth was slower than aggregate GDP. In other words, we were in an export retarding growth path over this particular period. So that's the first key characteristic. The second aspect which we can see is key elements is when South African exporters face a shock, such as the 2010 crisis, we struggle to recover. So we see level shifts at that particular point. And we've seen, although we recovered from COVID, the recovery was far slower than other economies. If we unpack this further, this decline is across both services, particularly which only grew about 0.4% per annum from 2010, as well as goods, which only grew about 1.7, 1.8% per annum over the full period, 2010 at least to from 2000 to 2013. So the growth. Now, if we look further, the picture gets somewhat more depressing, and we see a substantial hollowing out of our export structure. The first is, if we take measures of comparative advantage based at, for example, at a 6-digit product level, what we actually see is from 2000 to 2022, we see a decline in the number of products we have a comparative advantage, a revealed comparative advantage. Secondly, we're seeing almost a halving in the share of our high-tech exports in our export bundle. Thirdly, we are experiencing declining sophistication and complexity. In effect, our export bundle is far in the periphery in the so-called product space. In fact, we're not close to other products that are easy to diversify to. And as Roderick and Houseman point out and show, that complexity and sophistication of exports is a key driver of future export growth. But we are not close. We're not close to that point. Well, we're diminishing in terms of our complexity. And from that perspective, our potential for growth is being undermined by the composition and the structure of our exports. Underperformance of services exports has been noted and was discussed yesterday. Services exports have been particularly poor over the period, particularly from 2010. And the net implication is that minerals and metals remain salient feature of our export bundle. In fact, metals and minerals have also failed to grow substantially in terms of our export bundle. So we've got a real stagnant export structure, which doesn't differ much from 1990 to 2022. There are exceptions, of course. Yachts. I come from Cape Town. We are the world leader in exporting catamarans, high-end catamarans to the Caribbean. It's amazing. These are incredible boats. They're very successful. We export high-end sails that are used in these boats. We have enormous capabilities in the Western Cape in producing yachts. Citrus is another great example. Pears is another example. Avos, we're starting to export. Macadamia nuts, many of these agricultural products. So there are key areas where we've been very successful. Automotive, in fact, turns out that automotive has become the primary export of manufacturers in South Africa. That's the key area of diversification of manufacturing exports. But it's not clear that we've grown those exports on the basis of competitiveness. The automotive industry, as we know, has received substantial investment incentives, as well as indirect incentives through these duty rebate schemes and so on. We've also seen good progress in exporting to sub-Saharan Africa. It now accounts for around half our value of our exports of manufactured goods. There again, I'm going to come back to that later. Despite the success and the access under the trade agreements, the SADC free trade area, actually, when we look at the composition of those exports and we look at the firms that are exporting, it appears that that system has attracted exports under the preferences. What's driving the exports is not competitiveness of the domestic exporters or the firms, rather it's preference seeking. These firms are entering those markets that have very high preference margins. They tend to be small, they tend to be less efficient, and it's not clear that they can compete in the global market without these preferences. Nevertheless, we've seen some growth in exports through that. So why are we seeing this? Well, I think one key issue I would argue, and it relates to Dan's point yesterday, is this lack of dynamism within the domestic economy. And if we look at different indicators of dynamism, what we notice is from 2016, there's actually been a retreat from exporting. The number of firms engaging in exporting has declined substantially, and it's been across all major industries. Secondly, that decline has been driven by a couple of key features. Firstly, what we're seeing is declining entry rates. We're seeing rising exit rates, and we're seeing falling one-year survival rates. These have contributed to this decline in the export profile, or the number of exporters within South Africa. What's also interesting, though, is if we look at this data, is South Africa's entry rate is about 27%, and our exit rate is around 22 to 25%. That sounds high. It turns out, compared to upper middle-income economies, that's pretty low. And in addition, our survival rate seems pretty our one-year survival rate is quite high. Compared to other economies, our survival rate is actually higher. Now, it seems we have lower entry-exit rates, we have higher survival rates. This would suggest, well, maybe we're actually pretty good compared to other upper middle-income countries. But this reflects a particular characteristic of the South African export firm profile. What I would argue, it reflects the missing middle. What we are seeing is low entry rates, too little churn, and is occurring, and within that, too few firms are growing and becoming very large. And so our survival reflects really a particular type of firm that is able to enter the market. There are few of them, that's why the entry rate is not so high, and they tend to survive higher than comparative countries because they only enter if the survival possibilities are relatively high. So if we look, for example, if we look over time, what we see is a key characteristic stasis in our export structure. For example, less than 1% of the bottom 40% size group in 2013 fall in the top 20% in 2019. This is a critical issue because long run, we know evidence shows this long run export growth is driven by the extensive margin, the entry of new firms and products, which then grow substantially over a 10-year period. Costa Rica those new firms in 10 years account for 60% of the exports after the 10-year period. But we don't see this at all. In effect, we have so many small exporters exporting to the region in particular. We don't have the middle exporters. So we have, I would argue, we have a characteristic of a missing middle. We're not seeing the transition of entrance through the middle into the large. The net effect is we have a super concentrated export structure. And the figure I'm just presenting here is on the bottom axis. I'm just comparing South Africa at the two-digit level, the concentration within those two-digit levels, against other comparator countries using an exporter dynamic database. And this is the share of the top 5% in that accounted for, top 5% of exports, the share of the top 5% in the exports of that two-digit product. And anything above the line reflects South Africa's higher concentration than the comparator set of countries. So we have very concentrated export comparatively to other countries. Now, what underpins this? One aspect, well, maybe it actually is domestic foreign demand. Maybe we're facing large foreign demand constraints. And I think there's evidence of this and support of this. The entry of China in 2000, we showed in earlier work, crowded out our exports into the sub-Saharan African market. On the other hand, the entry of China into the global market boomed export GDP growth in Africa, which helped offset some of that crowding out effect. So the net effect wasn't so clear. We're talking about some demand headwinds currently, but granted, I think this is one aspect. But I think the primary issue is actually domestic. It reflects key constraints in the domestic supply environment in South Africa. The problem is a domestic one, not an international one, I would argue. And I think we can capture this is because most exporters export very low share of their total sales. So in other words, most firms that are exporting sell most of their products to the domestic market. Exports account for a relatively low share on average of exporters' total sales. And so what we see is the export performance is mimicked, or rather the export performance follows what's happening on the domestic production side. And if you look on the right-hand side, what I've just plotted out is the real volume of manufactured goods production and the real volume of mining production. And what we can see, it's flatlined over the period. And so in this context, it's actually declining and weak domestic growth, production growth, that in fact is passing on and feeding into the export structure as well. On top of that, what we're experiencing, as we saw a bit yesterday, is we're seeing declining productivity. This is important because as productivity falls, the access of the ability of domestic firms to compete in the international market is diminished, and that's impairing export performance. And then the final point I want to raise is that I think is the critical one. Exporters compete on the cost of non-traded inputs, essentially. And if the price of non-traded inputs is very high, the ability to compete internationally is undermined. And if you look across the gamut here, there's a range of factors that have raised the cost of non-traded inputs. Municipal services, which is critical, electricity, water, product market regulation, as Dan raised yesterday. These all raise the cost of operating in the domestic market, raise the cost of non-traded inputs, which is going to undermine the ability of these firms to compete internationally. So I would argue that the domestic constraints are primary issues. I think the key message then is an export policy can't be dealing from policies, domestic policies to improve domestic firm competitiveness. These are not separate. They're linked. So why do we need to boost export growth? I think there are many reasons. Some of them were raised yesterday. The critical issue, I think, is the foreign exchange constraint. We want to grow by 3%, we heard yesterday. Well, it turns out that our income elasticity of demand is 1.5. That's my only technical term for now. What means is that if we want to grow by 3%, our import bundle is going to grow between 4 and 5%. For a long, we can maybe finance that through foreign savings, but we know investment is super import intensive. And so for a long-term sustainability, we have to raise export growth to at least 4.5%. We, as I noted, are growing less than 2% per year, currently 1.5% per year, which is far below the 6% of the National Development Plan. And so if we want to grow, we have to grow exports because we're going to be boosting imports substantially in this growth path. I think a second reason is to drive and improve the long-run growth prospects through improvement of productivity again. And this was spoken again a bit yesterday. What we notice is that firms that enter into exporting are relatively productive. But when we actually look at the firm data and we see what happens to the productivity of firms when they enter into exporting, and as the picture on the bottom shows, a very crude event study analysis, essentially shows that when firms enter into the export market, they experience sharp increases in productivity growth. And the same actually holds for firms when they start entering into importing. And so exporting drives within firm productivity gains. Secondly, a key driver, as Dan spoke about yesterday, is the reorientation of the production structure. And as exporters grow, they grow faster, they're bigger, and as firms enter the international market and start exporting, the structure of the economy or the sector reorientates. We see reorientation of firms, or at least of production, towards these relatively efficient exporters. So the composition of firms shifts, and we see between firms shifts towards relatively efficient firms. This, I believe, drives much of the within-industry productivity improvements that Callum and Emmanuel showed yesterday. It's this within-industry structural shift across firms, and so both of it boost productivity. The final key reason I would say why we need to boost export is about deindustrialization and developing resilience to deindustrialization. So much is made about import competition driving our deindustrialization program. My sense is that's to some extent or to largely misplaced. I think import competition and the inability to compete against imports reflects a productivity problem within the domestic economy. And why this becomes critically important is firms in South Africa that are distant from the technological frontier absorb foreign labor absorbing technology. So they become productive through reducing the labor content of output. But unlike firms that are at the frontier of technology, those firms don't experience an increase in export growth. And the net effect is employment as a share of output falls. And so it's through the innovative firms that productivity gains can be translated into increased sales and exports, which offsets the employment loss associated with that productivity gain. But you have to be at the frontier to experience those gains. And I would argue we are not. And so that, I believe, is one of the key drivers of the decline in the share of manufacturing employment in the economy. A second critical factor is, and because it's my bedbug, deindustrialization is a 1980s phenomenon. It started then. It's not a recent phenomenon. And actually, when we look at the turning point of that, it coincides with the decline of the gold industry. And that's important because actually the South African manufacturing base grew off the gold industry. It produced the surpluses to enable import substitution, but also created the demand for manufactured inputs. And so that turning point was a critical one. Secondly, that point in 1980s was a turning point of investment decline, which is also a major driver of demand for manufactured goods. And so both the demand dimension is a critical factor, I think, also reducing and driving deindustrialization. I think where this becomes relevant is our failure to grow mining exports, which have been a critical source of rents, but also a critical source of demand for manufactured goods as well. The fourth one is addressing the employment crisis. We spoke a bit about this yesterday. The CDE, Anne, raise your hand, Anne. She's in the purple or pink top. She's noticeable for this. They wrote a great paper, and I think they challenged policymakers and all of us to think about how we could be strategic at the margin to try and alter policy, and particularly in relation to exports. And the argument here was, well, we need an export strategy, a labor-intensive export strategy, whereby we convert Kucha into a proper IDZ where they could receive proper benefits or incentives around boosting exports. And I think that has strong merit to consider as well, how we utilize these IDZs. But I think, as we heard yesterday, it's not so clear-cut anymore that exporting is going to drive employment. And in particular, it's not clear-cut that exporting is going to reduce our unemployment problem necessarily. Because when we look, if it's going to do so, it would require a dramatically different type of exporter than we currently have. Because when we look at the current exporters, what we notice, they tend to be skill-intensive. The skills they require are not the skills that the unemployed have. And so it's not clear-cut that growth in the current bundle of export or profile of exporters will raise unemployment or reduce unemployment. It's not going to absorb necessarily those workers into the labor market employment. Secondly, we've seen that automation, digitization, AI, and this increasing skills requirement has really closed the window for labor absorbing manufacturing export growth. This is Roderick's argument. So it's much tougher than before. But that doesn't mean we must discount the potential for exports to drive growth. Growth in exports will directly improve and create jobs. But we also need to consider, I'd say, that the indirect effects. And one key indirect effect is services. The ability to export is critically dependent on the availability of competitive services. Indirectly, services, a high share of our services is embodied in our goods exports. And so indirectly, growth in exports should generate jobs as well. Secondly, relating to this, actually exporters are bigger, so they do create jobs, but they also pay higher wages. So these are good jobs. And so I think there's additional merit and employment effects associated with that. Nevertheless, I think we need to be critical, and this is something we'll talk about here, is can we utilize, can exports drive an employment-led growth strategy? And I'm more circumspect about that than I used to be in the past. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think this is something we'll try and take up in the panel. And it relates to the previous point about whether we can actually embark. Maybe this is no longer possible. And I think there's several headwinds that we face. And what we know is this geopolitical tensions and global trade turbulence is really undermining the ability of firms to engage in the international market and to export. We've seen that undermining the multilateral rules system led by President Trump, but actually this started happening before that. And so the emblematic, I said, of all of these is, again, with the most prominent on our mind, is America's first trade policy. But it's more broadly, we're seeing across the board controls on technology transfers, on sales of semiconductors, and restrictions on critical minerals. We're seeing the imposition of climate-related trade and industry policies, the EU CBAM, which is now the UK is also implementing. Australia is talking about. This is extending broadly to many economies. This is problematic for South Africa. Unless Saul is right in the future, we can start producing energy and low-emission electricity. But unless we do so, this poses a real problem for us. And you can see this in the plot on the diagram here. If we just look at the number of discriminatory policies that are being implemented globally, what we can see, these far exceed the number of liberalizing policies. And so the world is getting, the market's getting tougher there. And then I pointed out the opportunities for export-led growth have dramatically reduced. So what do we do about this? I think it's much harder. I would argue there's still strong merits in thinking about exports and trying to boost exports, but we need to do it differently. We have to think about a broader strategy than just a manufacturing-led export growth. We need to think particularly about the agricultural sector, we need to think about the services, and in South Africa's context, we really need to boost minerals, our key resource and our comparative advantage sector. We need to think about policies that both boost domestic demand as well as exports, rather than just relying exclusively on the export market. What about employment? Well, one option is we try and prioritize some sectors where we do see some employment intensity, with those that are both tradable and labor absorption. There are some, we should try and focus on those. But I think it does mean also we need to accept slower structural transformation. Whereas other emerging economies like China structurally transformed rapidly into manufacturing through an export-led growth path, that opportunity for us is different. We're more likely and more increasingly moving from primary into services. And so structural transformation program, I think, would be slower. And the final point is we need to consider spreading the gains. What we're seeing is the gains are concentrated, and so if we have a policy of exports, we know the relatively skilled will benefit. It could further raise and push wage inequality. So we need to think much more distributively how to spread those gains. The last point I want to focus on is, I think I've got 10 minutes. Okay, I'm doing well. Is South African trade and industry policy fit for our export purpose? And our purpose? And I'm going to just raise a couple of key concerns or considerations and discussion points for him to discuss. I would say that we need to shift our industrial policy focus much more strongly around productivity, innovation, and competitiveness. Now, I'm repeating someone here called Professor Dave Kaplan, who, when he was the chief economist, raised this point. I think it was in 2000 and was it 7 or 8? I forget. He was ahead of the game. And I think we need to rethink our policy of what's the primary aim of industrial policy. And I would say it's about improving the competitiveness of the domestic production base. That, by doing that, we will both enhance domestic demand and growth, but we would also enhance export performance. I would argue that the focus on localization and protection will be misplaced. It will constrain our domestic industry to supplying the domestic market, and it will lead to inefficient firms. It's going to expose us to these pressures of technological change that drive deindustrialization far faster than we've had an export-oriented, productive economy. And so we will undermine our abilities. By focusing on this, I think we will exacerbate the deindustrialization problem that we currently face. I'm not saying that there's no space for this, but our core focus of industrial policy, I would argue, should shift. I think we also need to think about how we engage industrial policy. We are sector obsessed in South Africa, I would argue. We have an industrial policy action plan, which talks about sectors. We have the sector education training authorities, which focuses on sectors. We have sectoral wage bargaining, which focuses on sectors. But actually, what we know from yesterday, Dan was pointing out, we have enormous heterogeneity in firms. It's not clear-cut that the skills required to assemble electronic equipment is that different from the skills required to assemble clothing. But these are fundamentally different sectors. And so we see productivity dispersion overlaps sectoral dispersion, sectoral categorizations, to in effect, if we're focusing on productivity, to some extent makes sectors obsolete. They're still relevant, but they're undermining the distinction across sectors if we focus on productivity. We also know that GVCs are not sectoral structures. They depend on a wide range of inputs across different sectors. And so if we're thinking about exports, we need to think much more about these cross-cutting constraints that affect all firms that want to engage in exports, not necessarily the constraints they face within their particular sector, and so on. And I think the last point I want to make again here is that capabilities, which I think are key factors, also not sector-specific. So we need to rethink the role of the sector education training authorities to provide generic skills that exporters require, irrespective of their sector or industry, and so on. I'm going to leave the last one. I think also we should rethink the role of imports and technology, including imported technology in driving growth in exports. We see that exporters are highly dependent, and successful exporters are highly dependent on access to intermediate inputs. We see that firms that export, or firms that start to import and then export, they tend to export more value, more variety to more destinations. And so from a diversification point of view, access to imports is a critical part of the export strategy. I think we also think carefully about, and this relates, I suppose, to the global value chains, which also depend strongly on these export-import linkages. And I think the message really here, to some extent, is if we have high costs of accessing imports, we tax exporters twice. We tax them on accessing their key inputted good, and then we tax them when they try and get their good out. And so the detriment of high trade costs and high border costs, including tariffs, to some extent tax exporters twice, and they're much more detrimental than we, I think, sometimes consider. I like to put it at this point, because it's our non-traded input that drives our competitiveness, one of which is labor. In effect, border costs are a tax on labor, because someone has to absorb the cost. And the only way we can compete if we have border costs is if we pay lower wages, or we push the cost somewhere else. So ultimately, it's a tax of labor, wages, and employment. Is tariff policy fit for purpose? There are two dimensions, the internal and external dimension, and Elizabeth, I think, can talk quite a lot about the external dimension. I think we need to rethink the potential to expand access into international markets, this external dimension. And so I'd be very interested in hearing Elizabeth's points on some of these. And I would argue there's lots of scope for this. My sense is since 2010, with our strategic trade policy, we shifted to very narrow trade agreements, which are narrow in scope, like Mercosur. They didn't give us anything. What we need is much deeper trade agreements. And I think we have the scope to push those further. There's also increasing role for different kind of interventions, which are much harder. We're seeing the use of SPSs and other non-tariff barriers, which require government-to-government negotiations. And so the state is critical in negotiating access, and there's been enormous success in liaising with Africa. But on this exporting access story, one issue is the prioritization we have and the emphasis we place on AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, as a driver of our export growth. And I think there's enormous potential. In particular, what the UNCTAD Secretary General, for example, said, when trade becomes turbulent, neighbors matter. So maybe this is one way we can develop resilience. And I think there's strong merit in this, but I would be cautious about putting all of our eggs in the AfCFTA basket, all our export eggs in the AfCFTA basket. It's striking. You've all seen this picture. But Africa ain't small. Hey? It covers China, the United States, European Union, India, all of these economies. The implication is this is a massively vast continent. So the trade costs issue far outweigh any tariff reductions. So the emphasis then would be is if under the AfCFTA we would like to focus particularly on the annexes that reduce trade costs and non-tariff barriers, and then we may need regional infrastructure programs because it's the trade costs that are the primary constraint in accessing the market. But I also wanted to highlight just the size of Africa in terms of GDP, which is about the size of France. So focusing just on Africa, although it's bigger than South Africa, it's still a very small part of the global economy, effectively the size of France. So I would argue that we need, while regionalism is important, it doesn't really replace a stronger multilateral strategy to access international markets. And then finally, building on some of the points raised yesterday, and Marianne, I think, will talk a little bit about some of these issues too, is this issue of stop ignoring services. And we've seen dramatic increases, for example, in digitally delivered services exports. It's grown phenomenally, that's the red line. 3.5 times the amount from 2005, although it's been slower than international growth. And one reason links to what Dan was saying yesterday is if we look at the restrictiveness, our digital trade restrictiveness index, we are still more restrictive than many other economies. So I think there's regulatory reform that can boost this, this further. I haven't dealt with mining, which I think is critical, but I think we all understand the mining. So to summarize, I would argue South Africa faces a growth and industrialization crisis. The export crisis, I think, is part of this. It undermines, our poor export crisis undermines the economic growth and industrialization. I would argue we need an export-oriented, not an export-led growth path. While it's difficult, I think it's still desirable. But to do so, I think, would require a dramatic shift in how we think about policies and focus much more on improving the competitiveness of the domestic base, which will then enhance exports subsequently. Thank you very much. We're going to... Now I'm the chair. I'm transitioning into my role. I'm going to open up the floor to to the discussants who are going to, I think, not only hopefully talk about and reflect on my presentation, but I think reflect more broadly on their own particular experiences. So I'm going to start with Marianne, and then I'm going to then ask Elizabeth to follow.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good morning, everyone. It is lovely to be here this morning. Thank you, Lawrence, for setting the scene quite nicely. I think when you think about trade today, the key word is uncertainty. But there are things that we can do. And I always think that when we talk about exports, we think about it in such a macro way, we tend to forget that it is the firms that export. And I think well, Lawrence pointed out very well that exporting firms are more productive. They do employ more workers, and they do pay higher wages. And a very key point is that their productivity increase as they export more. So ultimately, I agree that we need a more conducive environment. And yesterday's presentations actually summarized this quite well. We need a functioning network industry. Operation Vulindlela was emphasized. And Dan really spoke about the product market deregulation and the trade barriers that we face. Lawrence highlighted that the problem is that we've got very few exporters who are responsible for the bulk of our export value. We have got a lot of small exporters, and these small exporters are supported by programs that are run in CEDA, for example, but they tend to export sporadically. So what is really missing is the medium-sized firms and in allowing them to scale in their exports. So a key consideration would be then to have product market deregulation, and the question to that then is, how do we do this? And removing tariffs on intermediate goods would be a good place to start. Because as soon as you've got higher input costs, you weaken the downstream industries. And this was also a point that was considered yesterday. And we really need to think about, if we have the strategy, what are the trade-offs to doing this? Research by XA advisors, so they do really in-depth research on tariff lines. They find that 93% of tariff lines have not been reviewed in more than 20 years. So in effect, only around 6% of duty-bearing tariff lines have been reviewed. So the argument is that when local production no longer exists and duties are not removed, then that has an impact on our competitiveness and productivity. So we have a system where firms are encouraged to apply for rebates. However, this really heightens the administrative complexity for firms, and that burden Dan spoke about yesterday, which ultimately affects productivity. So one could say that you would rather need to remove the duty as opposed to implementing a rebate. So where justification is justified, where protection is justified, think about shifting it to the downstream industries, not necessarily the upstream industries. Again, that influences competitiveness and productivity. A key outcome of the XA advisors' research also is that tariff lines and how duties are imposed is not really very transparent. And they make a really good point to say that, well, if these things are not reviewed, then protection seems to be evergreen. And essentially, we need to think more about sunset clauses to prevent infinite protection. But the key to that also is that you can have protection, but if you don't have a conducive business environment, then that protection also does not help, and it just raises uncompetitiveness in the economy. So I think Lawrence's point to having an export-oriented strategy is really essential. And he poses a good question to say that what route then is most viable for South Africa's export competitiveness. And yesterday we spoke a lot about services, and I think what was highlighted, and again this morning, is that tradable services are complements to manufacturing. Around 36% of value added in manufacturing comes from services. So if you think about services, it's quite wide-ranging. You can think about warehousing, security, packaging, finance, law services. So it's actually, services have a very big indirect multiplier effect when exporting firms are supported. So what we really need is scalability of higher valued manufacturing with service integrated segments. So Lawrence gave the example of the yacht manufacturers or chemical manufacturers, where you really think about incorporating services into it, like the design or finance or whatever. But then I think the indirect multiplier effect is big if you think about logistics, warehousing, etc. The point yesterday was also made that our services exports are low, and mutual recognition, I think, is an area where there is more work to be done. My last point just relates also to the AfCFTA, and I think it's always made like this goods story in that we are suddenly going to trade more goods. However, it's difficult. Lawrence illustrated that point to say that there are barriers, logistics, it's difficult to get stuff across Africa. And so the question is, how can we think about the AfCFTA in terms of what it also offers in services trade, in digital trade? But here we need to think about the regulatory barriers, licensing recognition, professional accreditation, even the things like visas. How do we make it more easy for people to visit other African countries? So regulatory integration is really imperative, and I think in terms of the digital environment, there's a lot of opportunities in payments, interoperability. So the digital trade protocol, along with the services protocol of the AfCFTA, is, I think, where there is a lot of opportunities for us, and where I'm sure the DTIC will make inroads, and we'll hear more about that. Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence.
Okay. So, Elizabeth, I think there are a couple of issues that you want to pick up. I mean, I'm particularly interested in part about the challenges of implementing trade policy and negotiating trade policy. And I think you've got a lot of first-hand insight. And so I sit at the exterior, we sit at the exterior, we make advice as academics, but to some extent we've got no clue how it really works. So now's your chance to tell us.
I'm going to move to this side.
That's not very encouraging. The professor says he has no clue how it works. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor. Yes, trade policy, you know, all policy. It's really simple. And there's never only one side to that coin. In fact, there are many. So one thinks that what you do will serve well, and then you discover that for someone it does not work. I want to say about services trade, it's not something we ignore. It's true that we haven't had services agreements in our earlier trade agreements. It's now being negotiated in the AfCFTA, but it has also been negotiated in SADC. In fact, the first round liberalizing 6 services sectors, the implementation of that is already underway, and they're negotiating further to include distribution, which includes retail, where you will know that we have a lot of interest in the continent. The AfCFTA and implementation of that, it is important. We put a lot of emphasis on it, but we don't emphasize only that. And I will get to that just now. Implementation, one needs to keep in mind competitiveness. You cannot implement it in such a way that you lose competitiveness. You also have to strike a balance between, for example, losing jobs through trade liberalization versus gaining. And I want to come back to what you emphasized, competitiveness. I mean, it's absolutely paramount. You simply cannot hope to export without competitiveness, but you can't even compete in your own market if you are not competitive. But the trade policy is certainly not the only determinant of competitiveness. You said that other policies, regulatory, transport, the availability of utilities, and then, of course, the employment issue. We say we want to move up the value chain, so we want to upgrade to higher level products. Well, the first hurdle you run into is the skills levels. So we need to improve skills from unskilled and semi-skilled to higher skilled. And we would need to have an education system that can produce that, but it won't be fast enough. We would have to find a different way to upgrade skills much faster. The point is, we cannot think about, if we say labor-intensive exports, we can no longer think of labor-intensive to mean unskilled intensive. I'll come back to the implementation of trade agreements. You know, for many years we were used to trade agreements were WTO Article 24 compliant, in other words, substantially all trade. And those were all of our earlier agreements, the EU, EFTA, European Free Trade Association, UK, and so on. Mercosur is actually the exception. Being a preferential trade agreement, partial scope, it covers about 1,000 tariff lines. We have about between 7,500 and 8,000 in our tariff book. But that was the exception. Since that, again, we've been negotiating the AfCFTA. The more interesting point at this stage, probably, you say don't put all your eggs in that basket. We are looking at other spreading our wings, so to speak. The export promotion people talk about the butterfly strategy, where they say the body of the butterfly represents Africa, and the wings represent either the long-established developed markets and the newer emerging high-growth markets. So while we were busy negotiating the AfCFTA, which was quite an intensive job, SACU, remember, we negotiate as SACU because we're in a customs union. We focused on that. But the SACU Council has now taken a decision that we also look broader. You know about CAEPA, the Chinese offer of duty-free access for 2 years. It's limited to 2 years. Countries have to negotiate reciprocal trade agreements with them during that time. So we're looking at that. We're looking at India. Last year, the President had a round of visits in the ASEAN countries. So we are investigating those, and we're also looking at the Middle East. So we will be spreading our wings beyond Africa. Lawrence, I think your does this start to answer you? Does this start to answer you? A few notes on,
No, it definitely
on the
does.
implementation.
It raises a couple of key questions. You know. Are we the tail or the head of the butterfly? I think we want to be the head. No, I think I think it is super interesting. I mean, to me, I think some of the key issues you've raised are the adjustment cost of liberalization, and what we know is the rise of anti-globalization sentiments in part is driven by the failure to account for the distributional effects of reform, and these are severe and they're constrained, and so thinking how you exit this industry if you engage in liberalization, I think is critical. Because the political economy forces are, I would argue, very strongly in favor of preventing job loss, which is rather than necessarily creating the new jobs which are not yet there, they're potential. And so it's very hard, I think it's very hard to engage in liberalization as strategies. I think linking to this, I mean, my sense is the challenge of the failure of the WTO is, at least in the WTO negotiation, there was quid pro quo. So you had a framework in which you could engage in multilateral liberalization, and thereby it forces your hand. But with the collapse of the WTO, that scope for that form of negotiation. So it'd be interesting if any of also if the audience have any interest in how do you implement and engage in a dramatic opening project. In relation to China, this is obviously a critical issue because we've got key labor-intensive sectors like clothing, textiles, which could be vulnerable in these, if we are going to negotiate a bilateral agreement. So I'd be interested, how do we actually do this is a hard one, and what should we do to offset the adjustment costs? I think that was one interesting point that also I thought popped up from yours. And maybe just to highlight again, because then we'll open it up to the floor to some comments. I think Marianne's focus on thinking carefully about the internal dimension of trade policy, I think, is critical, and that's an area that we really need to, again, also rethink the degree to which that internal dimension creates competitive industries and allows for the emergence of future exporters, and that's about how we use domestic trade policy to protect domestic industries to allow them to grow and develop, and that's quite, and I think the point you were raising on some of the constraints and challenges, I think, is important. So I think that's another area that we should think a little bit about. But let me, those were the 2 points that I found super interesting. Let's open to the floor for some questions and some critical questions, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to get the panel here to answer, not me. How's that? And actually, you got the, okay, you will do the side. And Elvis, and then who else? Okay, who's that? No, Justin. Okay, Justin. Okay, and then we'll take Stephen. You can do the next round. Start the next round.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. Kirsten BR. Hello, Elizabeth. Long time no see. Last time I saw Elizabeth, me and Lawrence had long hair.
Hey, don't remind me, please. Half the people in this audience didn't recognize me. Ben, where's Ben? He didn't even recognize me because I've run out of hair. It's terrible.
Yeah, it's terrible. Elizabeth, the question on DTI and trade policy and trade negotiation, people argue that we don't have enough negotiators. I think you're 5 people that has to do all the trade negotiations. Is that true, or is there a plan to expand it? Because if you think of the disruptions in global trade and you have to do bilateral negotiations, do we have enough people? And then the other worry that, speaking to Dan's points yesterday, is that DTI is sometimes responsible for most of the regulatory burdens that inhibit our trade. How are we dealing with this in the DTI? I think those are key worries that I have.
Thank you. Really interesting panel. So thanks to the panelists. We can't export what we don't produce, right? either regionally or globally. And in 2021, there was a very interesting paper by Arjun Chang about how we need to bring back production into our industrial policy. Is that the link between trade policy and industrial policy? And if we share similar thoughts, how do we actually do that? And secondly, the concentrated export structure, Lawrence, that you showed, reflects a concentrated production structure of the South African economy. And I don't mean this as a criticism of the competition economists, but the focus of some of the discussions has always been how do we remove barriers to entry so that we can reduce the level of concentration in the domestic structure. But the point you made around driving and increasing domestic demand, from a point of view, has to do with trying to create domestic linkages between the upstream and downstream segments of these production chains. How do we start doing that in order to generate some of the competitive advantages that you speak about, but also innovation and some of the learning processes that we do know occurs from trade and exports? Thank you.
Okay, I'm very glad I asked the panel to answer these questions.
I think I'm last. Justin Visagie from BITS. That was an excellent presentation and discussion. Thanks so much. Just to pick up on two things you really massaged, and the one was the necessity of domestic constraints as part of the kind of industrial policy reform to be competitive, and the heterogeneity of our local firms. And then your very interesting reflection on too much sectoral focus and the need for something else. And I just wonder what that something else might look like. Do we perhaps need to have a reshift towards thinking about local value chains and clusters that has a more place-based focus, which brings to bear the many constraints that firms face in their day-to-day lives, rather than something else that we've had? And I wonder if you've got any more thoughts as to, if we're not focusing on sectors, is that what it looks like, or what do you have in mind? Thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much. These are great questions. And so now I'm going to release them on the panel. So feel free to answer either, and then I'll pick up the slack.
Okay, so I'll start with Professor Kirsten on the trade negotiators. We are really short of hands. And we also, we used to say, well, when we do negotiating rounds, not just the background work, which of course is considerable, but the actual negotiations, we have more junior people there to train them. But at some point, we had budget constraints in government, and it becomes really difficult. Our capacity, what we do have is good, but we need more of it. And that's part of the reason why, while we negotiated the AfCFTA, we could not take on more. And if you think we have capacity constraints, even more so in the BLN countries, because we negotiate together, the five of us. So yes, we do have really good people, but we need to clone them 2 or 3 times. You said, Professor, the regulatory burden. Yes, there's always work on the way to simplify legislation, to fine-tune where it's necessary, to change where it's necessary. Maybe the processes are not fast enough. The realization that it has to happen and the work to make it happen is always underway. But as I said, it could happen faster. Maybe it can't happen faster because South Africa does have a proper legislative process. We don't wake up in the morning and change laws. Someone had a question then about the link between industrial and trade policy. Do you want to take that up?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to maybe add to Elizabeth, and I think in negotiations, having scientifically grounded selection or market selection becomes more important. So There are tools like the decision support model that identifies realistic export opportunities. Those become really important tools to strengthen the capacity. In terms of, my comment would be we can't export what we do not produce. I think here we can learn a lot from the product space literature in saying that if we have capabilities to produce a certain product, in terms of the product space, what else can we produce because we already have the capabilities? So a very simplistic example would be if you can grow beans, you have the capabilities to grow potatoes. But in terms of production, you can map out the product space to find out where are products that are close to what you are already making. You've got the capabilities, so it makes sense to start developing those types of products again. So I think that would be my comment on Hajun Chang's paper. Over to you, Lawrence.
Okay, thanks. So thanks. These are great questions. Elvis, I think you were asking James Hodge a question, and so we're very fortunate in the later session he can tell us why we don't have a competitive competition policy. So I'm going to leave that one for James. But your point is great, is because our super concentrated export structure didn't arise independently of our concentrated domestic industry structure. And so the failure exactly of finding firms that are able to access, to grow from being small to medium to large exporters, I think in part reflects something about the constraints to operate in the domestic economy. And so that comes to the critical point of, I don't think we can de-link trade issues or trade objectives from key policies that influence the competitiveness of the product market space and the ability of firms to compete and grow in the domestic economy. And I think that talks a little bit to your point about you need domestic firms in order to grow. And it's true, most exporters only export a fraction of the exports. And so if you can grow the domestic firms, they use this domestic market in many cases as a platform to expand the export market. And trade policy alone, in a way, is constraining it. But it is possible to encourage firms that only export. And that's, I think, is the role of FDI. And foreign direct investment is critical because it brings know-how and knowledge and capabilities of new products that we don't have capacity to produce. And so then it talks very carefully about how do you create spaces and encourage foreign-owned firms to come here in order to set new production platforms in areas that we don't have. And it comes very much, I think, to Dan's point earlier about the role of innovation and technology transfer. And so it's, again, because that's another mechanism that we're able to access new products. We're a major exporter of blueberries. It turns out those blueberries are purchased through royalty, a licensing agreement from abroad. So we didn't have the know-how, but we insourced the licensing of it. And so thinking carefully about how we can use international technology to create capabilities in new products, I think, is a way which we can do it. And these can be solely export-oriented too. But your point about the domestic, I think, is a kind of a critical one. My sense is, and it's a challenge, and Andrew Donaldson yesterday said we must be bold and big and target, and I think he's right. I'm just so nervous about our sole focus on targeting is we lost sight in our industrial policy. We lost sight of the critical issue of cross-cutting issues that affected all firms. So all our scarce resources were spent on trying to look very detailed how to build a narrow industrial policy in one particular sector, that we lost sight actually that a key role of the DTIC is to get the mining and the mineral and energy and the transport people working to boost domestic productivity. That's where the big gains were. And so, my sort of base premise is let's just get the fundamentals right and focus, spend our scarce resources on those and avoid the narrow targeting issue. And then the domestic industry, I think, will grow, obviously, in part. Justin's point is great on the local value and cluster and the issue of where the target point is. My sense is that different tiers of policy. The one is the global policy and the international policy, and Elizabeth spoke a little bit about accessing the foreign market. So that's a role of the state on behalf of all. There's also the national policy, in which the role of the state is to ensure that the product market regulations, for example, are good for firms to enter, and that's a policy for all. But then again, we need local policies. And then we start thinking again of the local interactions between firms and, for example, the provision of public services. The Cape Town port, the local rail system, the local housing constraint, the water, the local provision of electricity by municipalities. These are municipal and local provisions of non-traded inputs, which I think are critical for the competitiveness. And so that's a regional policy focus and the space for regional interaction. And my sense is exactly the businesses are critical because we know that industries, as your work has very clearly shown, are very concentrated and different. We've got a lot of citrus and grapes, for example. We don't have vehicles. And so our requirements of non-traded inputs and infrastructure are quite different from those of other countries, other regions as well. So the business environment interacting with the state and the local municipalities, I think, is a critical part of that. So inherently, you'll have bundles of local policies that reflect the particular industry composition and the needs of those industries. So that would be my third tier kind of point about coordination and interaction and so on. Great. Let's take some more. Stephen, and I think Callum, and then next year. So we've got three more there.
Thanks very much, Stephen Gelb, Independent. Thanks very much for the paper and the comments. Very interesting as the whole conference has been so far. I wanted to just raise 2 points which I think are important. One was actually just mentioned by Lawrence for the first time today, and that's FDI, which is very important, I think, for trade and also for services and technology transfer. And Lawrence mentioned correctly, I think, the importance of inward FDI in terms of transferring technologies and techniques and sort of raising the innovation frontier in South Africa, and I think that's very important. Equally important is outward FDI from South Africa to other countries. You know, when I was living here, which I haven't done for about 10, 12 years, I spent a lot of time vainly trying to get Elizabeth's bosses to think more about outward FDI, which they ignored. But actually outward FDI, not just into Africa, but even into Europe, into other parts of the world, is very important in terms of also technology transfer and services exports, actually, within the companies. And a lot of this actually goes on from South Africa, and I'm not sure it's taken into account in the trade data looking at goods or even the services trade data. So I think this is something that really needs to be thought about a lot more. The other point, aside from FDI, that I want to raise is informal trade, which is also, I think, very important in South Africa and also has not been mentioned. But there's a lot of more sort of qualitative material, a little bit of quantitative material looking now at how informal trade goes on, including, you know, from China and the rest of Asia into South Africa, particularly into the inner cities in Gauteng and Limpopo, and then going from there into the region, which again is, I think, services exports, retail services exports from here, which, you know, is happening at a very large scale, but also is not taken into account. And I think that, again, government needs to start thinking a lot harder about that informal sector, which I don't mean formalizing it in terms of taxes and so on, but trying to see how it can promote that kind of informal trade and get some wider benefits for that. Important there, I think, is also looking at migration, inward migration from Africa, because a lot of the people who are doing the trade are migrants in South Africa from the rest of the continent. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I thought it was a great presentation, very interesting, but there is one point that I wanted to, if not push back on, at least ask you more about, which is the framing of regional trade and the African Free Trade Agreement, because you framed it as sort of an alternative and, in your view, perhaps a lesser alternative to other trading partners, be they conventional or otherwise, and this was because of the comparatively low income level of what is a large market. But I don't think it's an either-or situation, because I don't think especially for South Africa, the ultimate potential of this is having larger source for final demand, right? The potential is in the establishment of regional value chains, and in that regard, things coming into South Africa become as important, if not more important, than things going out, because there's so, the value is in secondary processing, right? There's so much primary products coming out of other African countries to be processed very, very far away, and South Africa is one of the most mature economies on the continent. Surely has an opportunity to take some of that, and the barriers to bringing things in, I think, especially if it's specific single primary commodities, are much less than to sending a diverse set of products out to markets all across Africa. You just need like a single train line to bring in certain things down, and I think by viewing this as not an alternative to trade with the rest of the world, but actually as a facilitator for not just greater exports to the rest of the world, but also for participating at a higher value-added stage in that chain to the rest of the world, it brings much more potential from it than would be indicated just by the small GDP figure. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you for the presentation. Yolandi Smith from National Treasury. I want to raise something that I think comes up in your presentation, but not as explicitly as I would like to see it, for example. So how we deal with intellectual property in South Africa is quite a big thing, and I think it's got a particular impact on our export performance. If you think about how you mentioned innovation, how you mention imported technology and how important that is for knowledge transfer in South Africa, I suspect that the way we deal with intellectual property has got quite a bit of impact on what type of firms want to trade with South Africa, but also I think we've seen quite a few patents that could have been registered in South Africa being registered internationally because of the regime that we have. And that definitely affects our economic complexity of the products that we manufacture in South Africa, but also the dynamism we can see in the export area. Now, I know it's not necessarily fair to draw a direct link between that and the following that I've got to share, and that is, if you look at the Atlas of Economic Complexity that Harvard has, we've seen that in the last 15 years, only 7 new products have been exported from South Africa. Now, they are all in the minerals, metals, agriculture, and textile area. There's no complexity related to that. And I think the type of value change you can create from those type of exports are so short that it doesn't add value in South Africa for us. And I think that that is part of the issues, and we tend to tiptoe around it a little bit.
Great, another set of very interesting points. So I'm going to let our panel have a first stab as well. Any particular responses?
I obviously want to respond to all of it, but I want to take the FDI outward investment together with the regional value chains. A good number of years, we realized in SADC that we cannot just simply liberalize a market. If you work with countries that do not have a substantial manufacturing base, there will simply be no interest for them in that. So when we do economic integration in Africa, we look not only at market access, in other words, liberalizing tariffs. We look also at industrial development. And part of that, we figured that South African investment would have to go out into the continent to create that capacity, but that in turn will also be serving our own export interests. And of course, as you build value chains, we will import, we will export, and there would be broader and more mutually benefit in the continent. And that's also what we do under the AfCFTA. We created at some point a unit in the department called Trade and Invest Africa, who specifically facilitated outward investment into the continent. I know it doesn't cover Europe and America, whatever regions you might have had in mind. But that was the intention behind it. I think I will stop mine. Let me stop there for the moment.
Maybe you got some insights for Callum on the AfCFTA, the broader role. I think you made some interesting points. And how the DTIC is seeing the AfCFTA as more than just a trade agreement, but as a framework for regional and development.
Yeah. The AfCFTA is not just a trade agreement. It covers this industrial development, but apart from that, it has several protocols. You've mentioned them: investment, IP. You all remember the rest. Yeah. All of the protocols have been completed. Some of them still need to have annexes negotiated. In some cases, those have also been completed already. South Africa has already ratified 2 of them. We are starting to ratify the digital trade protocol. So that facilitates, I want to say, economic development, manufacturing, economic activity in all sorts of ways through the AfCFTA. Yeah, you say it's not an either or. No, it's not an either or. Certainly, there's no contention with that. You know, you said in the beginning, Professor, that our exports into SADC seem to be largely preference-driven. Yes, it might be true, but maybe the merit of that is that the domestic company that can now export more, even if it's preference-driven, has the potential to build these economies of scale and there with competitiveness. Yeah, whether you will do that, that's a different matter. But the possibility, we would think, is created through that.
Thanks.
Yes, so just on the point on the informal trade, we've done some research in understanding trade more from an entrepreneurial perspective, and especially for women entrepreneurs. And they tend to really trade informally. So these suitcase exporters, we call them. And it makes a huge difference, and especially if you think about the societal impact. These women entrepreneurs feel, or they have a need for making a positive contribution to their communities, and they view exports as being a means to do so. So the challenge that they face is the high costs. So, I mean, you can put a suitcase in a taxi and then that can go. But if you go via logistics companies, then those costs become inhibitive. So I think big logistics companies who do these small parcels, they can unlock the competitiveness of this. So I agree that there's a lot of potential, and it has a big societal impact, especially on an entrepreneurial level. Thank you.
Great. I mean, maybe just picking up on that point. I mean, I like that because, I mean, the degree to which costs of accessing the export market are full, we should see more entry. And I think what Marianne's, I like about that point is it's also inclusive. And so we think about exporting focus, but Marianne's really pointed, and Stephen, I think you pointed out the role of importing as an inclusive way of creating opportunities and jobs. And that informal trade is one way in which to do it. So lowering these costs actually means that you can broaden trade and the gains from trade. And the gender dimension, I think, is really important. And then it talks to the distributional effects. So that, yeah, very interesting. maybe just a few more. Stephen, I think I like your point because we think of trade in goods, but actually capital flows and people are also part of the issue, and putting those on the table is really an interesting intervention. And Callum, I think maybe I don't. I think the AfCFTA is critically important. But when you read the industrial policy strategies and the strategies of industrialization, a lot of emphasis is placed on the AfCFTA in terms of our export program to drive that. And so my key point is we need to be cautious. We must be broader. It's part of the strategy. It's not the only strategy. But your point is critical, I think, in terms of what the role of the AfCFTA is. The hard bit, one of the hard bits is negotiating the tariff reductions. Those, from South Africa's perspective, are not that important. Yes, getting into Kenya, getting into Egypt is important. But because we've already got access to most of Southern Africa through the SADC free trade area. So there's no additional gains from market access through low tariffs in much of the African continent. Some of the big markets, Nigeria, etc., and so there are huge gains. The critical thing for us is getting our goods there. And so that then talks really to the annexes to the trade protocol, which really focus on the non-tariff barriers, the tariff barriers, the trade facilitation agreement to enhance and reduce the trade costs. And then I think the AfCFTA can be a critical framework to negotiate and coordinate infrastructure development. And why this is so important is because our access into the Ethiopian market depends not on our infrastructure. It depends on what Zimbabwe is doing, Zambia is doing, Kenya is doing before we get it. And so a coordinated program of improving trade facilitation, I think, is kind of central. And the World Trade Organization TFA agreement was trying to do that. The central, one of the key considerations still, I think there's a lot of work to be done. We've signed these protocols, but there are also inherent limitations in some of these annexes. Let's take the trade facilitation agreement. There's no supranational body within the AfCFTA agreement to drive the trade facilitation agreement. It's based still on individual countries. And so it requires countries to lobby and raise complaints to other countries if there's a barrier to trade. And then they're supposed to negotiate it between the two. And what we've seen is, Trellick shows very, and Gerrit Erasmus argues very carefully, that actually government to government, that sort of negotiation, or taking another government to court, or it doesn't seem to happen within it. And so there's need, I think, of a broader way of rethinking how you implement these. And then your points, exactly, I think you're on target on what the focus should be. Yolanda, I think the IP, I think, is super interesting. Maybe if I was controversial, I think we can benefit more from buying IP than selling IP. And the reason why I would argue this is, if we look at the data, what we see is that there is R&D incurring to developing IP, and part of the tax incentives do it, but actually that's diminishing in terms of the number of firms. The number of firms are doing are very few, and they tend to be very large. And in fact, they're not so many. What has grown phenomenally are firms purchasing IP through in-licensing. And that's where the revenue and the firms seem to be spending their money on, at least according to the tax data. And so we see this insourcing and purchasing of intellectual property. And actually, that's not unrelated to R&D. And so I think there's huge scope for us to just absorb foreign technology. And I think we should, rather than, I think developing IP is important, but let's not forget the critical importance of purchasing IP. I also think we want to think carefully about this complexity argument. And the complexity sounds fantastic, but it's an outcome, I would argue, of capabilities. And it's an outcome of non-traded input costs, because complex products require lots of capabilities and require lots of steps in the production chain. And so if you have high costs, non-traded input costs, we regress back to low complex products. So that's part of the reversal of an industrialization program. And so it's not surprising we're struggling to export complex products. But again, I would be critical of saying we're a resource abundance economy. We should be exporting more resources, even if they're not complex, because they give us the foreign exchange. and so I would be, again, wary of overemphasizing the importance of complexity versus us actually trying to increase exports across the board, and so on. Those are I think, one of my thoughts around some of those. Apparently, this time's up. I know you're desperate to ask more questions, but maybe over tea. But thank you very much. That was a great session.